I'm Gordon Haff, Emerging Technology Evangelist at Red Hat, and today I'd like to talk with you about preserving privacy while sharing data. Sharing data can accelerate innovation in a lot of different fields, from telecoms to healthcare to government to energy and so forth. And this is particularly true with all the open data sets out there that we can combine together in various ways. And this whole process is being accelerated as well by the fact that some of the best techniques that we've come up with recently, such as deep learning, many types of machine learning, really require vast amounts of data in order to be effective. But there's a problem. Data can be sensitive, data can be private. So it becomes important to think about ways that we can share and act on data without revealing information that people and organizations don't want to be revealed. And that's the subject of today's talk. Before we dive down into the details, let's look at a map of the territory, so to speak. This comes from Andrew Trask of Open Mind, and I think it lays out nicely some of the different sort of overlapping considerations to think about and to deal with when talking about privacy and when you're sharing data. On the lower left, you have input privacy, and this is various ways to essentially protect data as it is, for example, being computed upon and aggregated. And you see here things like homomorphic encryption, fully homomorphic encryption, zero knowledge proofs. I'm not going to spend time down there today because fully homomorphic encryption, while it's a very interesting technique because it allows you to have computation done, for example, on a public cloud provider where the data that is being worked on is all encrypted. So there is no opportunity, no real need for trust in organizations or people in order to protect the confidentiality of that data, but is very compute intensive, although it's an area of significant research today is interesting, but really isn't practical in any kind of a production sense today. I will spend some time, however, talking about multi-party computation, which, as you see, overlaps with the policy enforcement circle up there, because the protocol that's used for multi-party computation does, in a sense, provide a policy around the protection of data confidentiality. But at the same time, it is also a way to get input privacy. But I'll be spending some more time in that. Trusted execution environments are also in that same general category. This is also an area of active research with things like the Confidential Computing Consortium, Project NARCs being one of the projects that are associated with TEEs. And again, those are ways that you can, for example, execute operations on a cloud provider, and you don't need to trust much of the underlying software stack because the TEE provides certain types of attestation and so forth that makes that trust unnecessary. In the lower right-hand corner, and this is where I'm going to spend the bulk of my time here today, is how do you protect the privacy of data that's being shared and that's being aggregated. And a lot of traditional anonymization techniques go into here, although some of those arguably apply to input privacy as well. But a particular technique I'm going to talk about in this area is differential privacy, which essentially brings formal methods to aggregating collections of data. So those are the areas that we're going to look at today. Let's start by talking about anonymization more generally, though. And very closely related to this, and we can probably just take them as being the same thing for our purposes today, is pseudo-anonymization, which is rather than stripping out data, sensitive data, from a record, is replacing the sensitive data with some sort of token or pseudonym, if you would, in those particular fields. And certainly the naive or the simple way of thinking about anonymization is simply that we are removing things like names, addresses, social security numbers, those kind of classic identifying fields that would go be attached to some sort of record of things like healthcare information or financial records and so forth. We can also encrypt or transform personal data fields to make them harder to de-anonymize. So for example, in a healthcare record, you might have a date of birth. And when you, in fact, you'll certainly have a date of birth. However, when you share that data, maybe the exact date of birth isn't very important. Maybe it's fine just to say somebody is 30 years old or they were born in a particular year, or maybe even they were born in a particular decade. And obviously there's a certain art to figuring out, how much you can transform data before it becomes less useful. But nonetheless, it is a technique that can be used to help protect the sensitive information in a set of data. And then finally, you can aggregate by a trusted agency. And this still doesn't provide perfect anonymization for reasons that I'll get into, but is certainly a very common way of protecting individual data points while still having a meaningful set of data that is aggregated up across a population. And very good example of this that's very familiar to a lot of people is census, demographic, etc. types of data that the U.S. Census aggregates in various ways that they that try to preserve anonymity of the individuals who have taken a survey. And I'm going to talk about that in a lot more detail in a few slides. And the question is, does all of this work? And the answer is yes, kinda, sorta. A lot of the time, it depends upon what your assumptions are, because there's quite a few challenges. So the first is even defining what constitutes personal data in the first place. And this doesn't have a straightforward answer because, for example, something like salary data, for example, might be considered by many people to be personal, sensitive types of data. And yet, is required to be disclosed in some situations, for instance, government employees in much of the US. And in some countries, it's a norm that salary data is public. So you first of all have to determine what actually constitutes sensitive data. And this can also be complicated for reasons I'll get to in a moment. I mentioned a trusted aggregator in the last slide, but who can you really trust? A lot of private organizations sell data for profit these days, and also there's data breaches. Do you trust a company to keep your personal records safe? There's also some specific technical issues that relate to aggregating data, and one of them is the lack of data diversity. And anonymity failures is one term that's used in this area. And basically, what this means is that if it's known that you are part of a data set, that by itself can reveal something about you. Now, the fact that you're a US citizen, for example, doesn't reveal an awful lot other than the fact, of course, that you're a US citizen. But if you're in some particular health database, for example, that may reveal that you were tested for some particular disease, which presumably increases the probability that you actually have that disease. And then finally, and again, this is a whole field of study and get into a lot more detail here, but there's a general susceptibility to certain types of attacks. And it actually turns out that when researchers study this kind of thing, a lot of aggregated data and anonymized data that I think the average individual would say, well, yeah, that seems like it's pretty anonymized and that ought to be okay. But researchers have come up with ways, some of which are admittedly probably a bit artificial in real world data sets, where it is at least in principle possible to re-identify individuals in those data sets in a number of different ways. And even if they can't do it perfectly, they can do it in a statistical way. So we can say, well, I don't know that this data point is this person, but there's a 30% chance, a 50% chance. And in many cases, that's all that you need in some cases, say if somebody is trying to track down that individual. One of the particular attacks, and this is from a U.S. Census Bureau slide. The U.S. Census Bureau actually has a lot of good information if you all dig into this kind of thing in more detail. And on the right-hand side, you would have certain types of aggregation with statistical measures against those aggregates. So a number of females, the number of males, the numbers of white, black, married, black females, etc. And none of those are one. They all are an aggregate of some number of individuals, and we could increase the numbers here too. But really, you can think of that as almost a set of simultaneous equations which can be solved for. And it again can be transformed then by solving that set of equations into some very specific data points that don't have a name attached to them, but are unique fingerprints, which, at least in smaller data sets, may make it possible to, again, statistically perhaps, figure out what is the entire set of data that applies to this particular individual. We can also identify patterns. This is an online fitness tracker set of data points from some individual. And if you look at these patterns, you can look at that and go, this individual that this belongs to, I don't know their name, I don't know their address, I don't know anything else about them, but they seem to concentrate their time in a fairly limited area, which is where the bright white is in that screenshot. And we might infer the person lives right around there somewhere. Now, maybe they get in their car and they drive to a park and that's where they do their running. Maybe. But if somebody is trying to track somebody down, for example, something like this would give them a pretty good idea. And certainly similar if this was done with GPS tracks from automobiles or anything like that. If somebody is always coming and going to this house, that tells us something about that's probably where they live. And if they're going a lot to another house somewhere, well, that tells us something as well about their patterns. particularly interesting area and probably particularly relevant today, and will be very relevant when we talk about differential privacy, is this idea of linkage attacks. So what we have here in the left is hospital visits for an individual. This is an anonymized, in principle, anonymized record. There's no one's name here. There's no social security number here. But it does include some relevant identifying information, a date of birth, gender, and a zip code. Date of birth, we could fuzz that a bit by just changing that to a year, as I mentioned earlier. Zip code is presumably a 5-digit zip code, not a 9-digit zip code. Although even then, zip codes can be pretty small when you get into more rural areas, for example. But let's assume, for purposes of argument, that we have a record that, taken by itself, is pretty anonymous. Well, the same individual has other records that are out there in open data sets, or even that may be legally required to be public for various reasons. So voter registration in many places will have information like name, address, phone number, and as well as maybe date of birth, gender, almost certainly zip code. And again, you can argue, how much of this is public in a given case, but for purposes of our discussion here, let's assume that there is some number of fields that might overlap with a piece of sensitive data. And we can start to do correlations. And of course, there's not just one public record, there's probably many public records. And to illustrate this, a particularly interesting example comes from a number of years back, when many of you may remember there was something called the Netflix Prize. And the idea with Netflix Prize was Netflix released a whole bunch of records that were anonymized, so no names, no usernames, no zip codes, no other information, IP addresses that maybe could start to give a fingerprint for a user, even if their name wasn't attached. And these records were, basically, Alice really liked these 3 movies, hated these 4 movies. Bob loved this one movie, hated everything else, and so forth. And it's anonymized, supposedly. Now, what these researchers did was they took that Netflix data, which was intended basically for researchers to develop machine learning algorithms to improve Netflix's recommendation engine, which didn't really work out all that well for other reasons that aren't relevant here. But in any case, there was this large public data set. And what these researchers did was they looked at another public data set, which is the rating information in the Internet Movie Database. And again, you have users who like movies, don't like movies, and so forth. And in those cases, at least some of those users are probably able to be identified because they may have a name that they use across different logins. They may use something that is their actual real life name, their real true name. And by combining those 2 different data sets, what the researchers were able to do was essentially look at everybody's fingerprint in the Netflix data and everybody's fingerprint in the IMDb data and discover that, if somebody liked these 3 movies and hated these 4 movies, and maybe hardly anybody hates one of those 4 movies, and yet there's a very similar record in the IMDb database that has a very similar type of fingerprint, you start going, that might very well be the same person. And I'm not going to keep repeating this. There may be a statistical inference. We may not be 100% sure. It's not a smoking gun we can take to court, but it starts to be a pretty good indicator. And maybe you can correlate them with yet a third database of some sort, which has a similar type of correlation pattern, and we can start to de-anonymize the data. Now, nothing here. It's probably not a serious matter if someone uncovers that, aha, he didn't like the Star Wars prequels. Well, did anyone like Star Wars prequels? But that's a different matter. But certainly you can imagine this being a more serious case if we were talking healthcare records, for example. This is not a new problem, and solutions to this are not new. Going back to the 1930s, the US Census, for example, stopped publishing small area data. And this is the sort of problem I was talking about earlier. If you have a census tract that one family or two families lived in, and you publish that aggregated data, well, you're not really anonymizing it because there aren't that many people that could be in that small area. This, by the way, is a similar type of thing to what, say, Red Hat does with employee surveys, where you ask respondents a whole bunch of questions, including questions about their manager, and then the aggregated data is published within the company. And data is also shared directly with the individual's managers, but it's only shared with them if they have a certain number of direct reports. Because after all, if they only have one direct report, the aggregation of the data of their direct reports is the same thing as how that individual answered. And even if you had 2 or 3 direct reports, and the manager in aggregate gets a bad rating, and they have a good working relationship with 2 of their employees and a bad relationship with their third employee, they can make pretty good inferences from that. But let's fast forward to today and start and talk about formal privacy, which the US Census Bureau adopted in 2020. And specifically, the technique of differential privacy, which comes from a 2006 paper, so it's fairly recent, about something called epsilon differential privacy specifically. And the impetus of differential privacy is the fact that as you have all these very large data sets, as machine learning has gotten extremely powerful, a lot of the traditional, many cases somewhat ad hoc, statistical disclosure limitation techniques are really starting to be ineffective, and intuitions about what was sufficient anonymization were becoming less and less useful. And the basic idea here is to widely share statistics over a set of data without revealing anything about the individuals. That's the real objective here. Some of the requirements: what be a formal model. So again, not ad hoc, but having math against it. Resist both these kind of linkage attacks I've talked to, and hopefully resist future attacks that we might not know about today. And importantly, and again, this was the main impetus behind it, is to be effective in places where there may be a lot of these external data sets available. The basic way differential privacy works is injecting random data into a data set in a mathematical, rigorous way to protect individual privacy. And the value of the randomness trades off privacy and utility and accuracy. So if you look at the right-hand side here, the idea is that you have data is aggregated by a trusted curator, Alice. You have a querier who you can't trust not to try and get at sensitive data. The querier puts query in to the curator. The curator comes up with an answer, and then the curator adds some noise. And that noise is mathematically guaranteed to be sufficient to keep the querier from being able to de-anonymize the subject of their query. And the other way to kind of think about this is that you have this real world computation. So you've got a query, a request, do some computation, get an output. You have a different input that doesn't include the data from somebody, an individual. Do computation analysis of that, output it. The difference between those two is at most a value of epsilon. This is, so in other words, you can have a data set and you don't know mathematically whether an individual person is in that data set or not. There are some limitations here. Base rate, so basically if I know certain public characteristics about you, such as sex, age, and so forth, I can infer certain things about you, such as your likelihood to come down with some disease, without knowing any private information about you. Anonymizing data doesn't change that fact. The noise is something of concern in that there is this idea that you are injecting noise into data. So at some level, the result isn't as good as it could be otherwise. And this was a concern by a number of researchers with the US Census use of technique, for example. Subsequent research suggests that in general, you can strike a pretty good balance here between protection of sensitive data and the accuracy of the overall aggregated data set. The final and probably the most difficult problem here is the idea of repeated queries. I mentioned this epsilon value earlier. And it's probably a better way just to talk about it is you can set a privacy budget. The thing is, you use up that budget every time you do a query against a set of data, which is a particular problem in a lot of modern systems where you're doing digital queries rather than just having some aggregated tables that you can access to. And there are ways to deal with this. So for example, a randomized subset of data can be used. And once the privacy budget is exceeded, you can have a different randomized subset of data. So there are techniques there, but nonetheless, it's a limitation. Now, all of this is assumed that we have a trusted third party, but what if we don't? And that's where the multi-party computation I mentioned at the beginning comes in. This is essentially collaborative analysis of siloed data sets without trusting a third party. Essentially, you have a protocol that is equivalent to an incorruptible trusted party. And conceptually, some of this is similar to how enterprise distributed ledger technology, blockchains work. And the basic mechanism here is that parties can jointly compute a function on their own on a share of inputs using a protocol without information about those inputs being revealed. The objective here is to preserve privacy and correctness. At the same time, there is an assumption, and there is an assumption that some number of participants will be trying to break the protocol, will collude with each other, and exactly how you implement multi-party computation does somewhat depend on the threat model that you're assuming. So if you're assuming that one party may, by design or by accident, reveal data if they could, that is a different threat model than if you assume 50% of the parties may collude in a way to sort of pierce the veil, so to speak. And then you also need to think about how much overhead is involved. It works by, you have a protocol distributing encrypted, specifically AES shares of data. As I said, the implementation and efficiency depends on threat assumptions. And although there's different overheads with different threat models and so forth, in general, we can say that unlike, say, fully homomorphic encryption, the compute overhead is fairly low, but there's a lot of communications overhead because you've got all these cryptographic encrypted communications taking place between parties. One specific use of this came out of Boston University in the city of Boston, where participating companies shared their individual wage data, but in a way that was protected by cryptography. So they weren't letting any third party actually see the unencrypted data shares. If you are interested in this topic, we've actually written and had some interviews on Red Hat Research Quarterly, and give you a plug because it's one of the organizations at Red Hat I do a lot of work with. Suggest you subscribe to our newsletter. There's also a related website that has a lot of information about ongoing research happening at Boston University and other universities that are associated with Red Hat research. Boston University Red Hat Collaboratory is where some of that's taking place. And I mentioned at the very beginning Andrew Trask and OpenMind. If you're the sort that likes to get their hands dirty on this stuff, there is a Python libraries there that let you play around with differential privacy and multi-party computation. So with that, thank you, and we have some time for some questions.